I know you.
Yeah.
When you're on 26 years, I mean, where's the challenge?
Gives you a charge.
Yeah, but what do you need a charge? 26 years, walk away, it's over.
Yeah.
I mean, 26 years. I sat with Ed the other night. He said, how long is he going to keep going like this? He's worried about that little tap dancer on Star Search. Gloria Kowalczyk. 341. Gloria opens up at the Palace in Encino Friday. With a 341. That show is annoying, Ed. I'll tell you. We know each other a long time.
We do.
I know you as one of the finest impressionists. You do great impressions.
Thank you.
Besides that, I'm delighted that you have a show because you're fresh, you're funny, you're great. And I want you to know something. From my heart, I never liked you. Now, the Gentile gentleman here had no idea. A kipper. That's a Jewish fish. Don't be dumb. I hate a dumb guy. He wouldn't be governor if my people didn't go, okay.
For over half a century, the public was all too familiar with a defiant Don Rickles ruling the Las Vegas stage, a sharp-witted, bald-headed man who specialized in roasting the appearance and ethnicity of his audience, yet was deeply revered by all of Hollywood. Everyone was certain that someone possessing the most toxic mouth in America must have had a heart of stone, a man reckless and completely immune to any pain in the world. Yet, behind those jokes lay a completely different life. An unemployed actor who almost gave up on his dreams. A father carrying the agonizing pain of losing his child until his final days. And the most surprising twist of all, the man famous for insulting others was the very one who always feared hurting someone's feelings. To bring you the most authentic and profound perspective, we have researched and referenced his two official memoirs, Rickles' book and Rickles' letters, combined with official archives from NBC, the American Film Institute, AFI, and records from the Mount Sinai Memorial Park. We respect the truth and will strip away all the fabricated myths surrounding him. To find the answers, we must turn back the clock and return to the early, impoverished years of a young man from Queens, New York. It all began on the 8th of May, 1926, in a cramped apartment in Jackson Heights, Queens, New York. That was where baby Donald J. Rickles uttered his first cries into the world, born to a Jewish immigrant family. His father, Max Rickles, was a gentle man who had migrated from distant Lithuania, struggling year-round with a highly precarious job selling insurance. His mother, Etta, on the other hand, was a remarkably strong-willed, resourceful, Austrian-born woman, and it was she who shaped the ironclad discipline of the household. Like many Jewish immigrant families of the era, their tiny home constantly echoed with the ancient Yiddish language, the sole thread connecting them to their roots, while American society was spiraling downward into the Great Depression. Who could have ever guessed that a king of insult comedy, a man who would later willingly challenge the most powerful figures, was once an incredibly timid child? Indeed, in his youth, Don Rickles was no rowdy teenager or neighborhood bully. On the contrary, he grew up with a vague but constant sense of dread. He feared the bigger boys lingering on the street corners, dreaded his shaky grades at Newtown High School, and above all, he feared poverty, dreading the anxious look in his parents' eyes whenever the rent bill arrived. In his 2007 autobiography, Rickles' book, a memoir, he candidly confessed that he didn't have a single rebellious bone in his body. To young Don back then, laughter was by no means a weapon to attack others. It was a defensive shield. He realized that if he made the bullies laugh, they would forget about wanting to punch him in the face. That was the very first survival lesson the streets of New York taught him. Then, The first major turning point in the young man's life arrived in 1943. As World War II entered its most brutal phase, Don Rickles turned 17 and had just graduated from high school. Following his father's advice that a real man needed to be forged through fire, Don decided to enlist in the United States Navy. The young man, who had never spent a single day away from his mother's embrace in Queens, was suddenly thrown onto the tender ship USS Cyrene, sailing across the unfamiliar waters of the Philippine theater. Can you picture the feeling of a young soldier standing on the thin line between life and death? The sweltering tropical heat, the suffocating stench of engine oil mixed with the terrifying obsession of Japanese kamikaze suicide attacks. Yet, in the darkest, most claustrophobic moments on the ship's deck, Don Rickles' comedic instinct flared up stronger than ever. To dispel the absolute terror gripping his comrades before heading into battle, Don began putting on a show. He masterfully mimicked the commanding officers and roasted the bad habits and distinct facial features of the sailors. Strangely enough, amidst an environment thick with the smell of gunpowder, Don's teasing remarks became an invaluable psychological remedy, helping the young servicemen find a bit of laughter to cling to for survival. Perhaps those years drifting on the waters of the Philippines taught Don a profound lesson. Sometimes you need a little grit, a little roughness, to face a cruel reality. In 1946, the war ended, and Don Rickles was discharged, returning to his hometown of New York with a heart full of 20-something aspirations, thanks to the financial backing of the GI Bill for veterans. He made a daring choice, enrolling at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. Ironically, Don Rickles' original goal was never to become a comedian. His sole burning desire at the time was to be a legitimate dramatic actor, standing beneath the sacred stage lights to recite Shakespearean verses or embody classic tragic roles. During that period, he sat in the same classroom as brilliant talents who would later become cinema legends such as Grace Kelly and Anne Bancroft. But life is never that easy, is it? While his peers possessed the radiant looks perfectly suited for Hollywood standards, Don Rickles felt deeply insecure about his rather rugged appearance, his stocky build, and his hair, which had begun thinning prematurely at an all too young age. For years after graduation, he received nothing but cold rejections from Broadway casting directors. Wandering from one audition to the next without catching a single break pushed Don into utter despair. Painfully, that wasn't even the rock bottom of his tragedy. In 1953, a devastating event struck, completely shattering his world. His beloved father, Max Rickles, suddenly collapsed from a massive heart attack and passed away forever. The loss of the family provider not only left a gaping void in Don's heart, but also plunged him and his mother into total financial ruin. His lofty theatrical dreams and romantic Shakespearean roles crumbled to pieces that very afternoon. Facing Don now was his grieving, broken mother and a mountain of debt. He understood that he could no longer live for his personal passion. He needed money, and he needed it immediately to support his mother. Wiping away the tears that streamed down his face after his father's funeral, Don Rickles was forced to embark on a journey he himself had once held a deep prejudice against. Working as a traveling comedian in cheap Brooklyn nightclubs. These were rundown spots, thick with cigarette smoke and alcohol fumes, where audiences didn't come to appreciate art, but to get drunk and heckle. Initially, Don tried to perform in the traditional way, standing there reading pre-written jokes with a strained smile on his face. The only results he reaped were loud jeers and glass tumblers nearly flying at his face. Until one terrible night, when a drunkard repeatedly shouted vulgar insults at him from the crowd, Don Rickles, already carrying a brooding, resentful mood due to his fate, snapped. He turned up his microphone, stared straight at the man, and unleashed a brutal yet incredibly sharp tirade of insults targeting the man's obese appearance. The entire room fell dead silent for a second, before exploding into the most hysterical laughter. The audience was thrilled by that brutally honest savagery. It was right at that edge of total collapse that Don Rickles' comedy was reborn. It was not born out of a fulfilling life, but forged from the ruins of a shattered dream, from the grief of losing his father, and from raw, unforgiving survival instincts. The young man from Queens had accepted throwing away the mask of a dramatic actor to put on the armor of a cynic, using the hardness of his words to earn a living. Yet, that battle for survival at the bottom of the nightclub scene was merely the beginning, because fate was about to thrust him onto a much higher launching pad where his notorious mouth would lead him into a world rife with the perilous traps of fortune, fame, and underground syndicates. To talk about the turning point that altered Don Rickles' destiny, we have to travel back to a freezing winter night in 1957. The setting had shifted from the shabby suburban pubs to Murray Franklin's, a more prominent nightclub in Miami Beach. That night, the room was packed to the brim, with thick smoke swirling and blending with the clinking of glasses. Don was standing on stage, dripping with sweat, churning out his familiar comedic routines. Then, a bone-chilling silence suddenly blanketed the club. The entrance buzzed. The most powerful man in American entertainment at the time, the boss Frank Sinatra, had just walked in alongside his thuggish entourage. Why don't you try putting yourself in Don Rickles' shoes at that moment? A low-tier comedian with zero fame to his name, suddenly forced to confront a music superstar notorious for his volatile temper? A man with intimate ties to both politicians and mafia families. Normally, one would choose the safest route, bowing respectfully or uttering sweet, flattering words to please the big shot. But the defiant nature of a boy raised on the streets of Queens wouldn't allow Don to do that. He understood this was his only shot, either shine forever or sink into oblivion. Don looked straight into Sinatra's icy blue eyes, gripped his microphone, and loudly proclaimed, "Make yourself at home, Frank! Hit somebody!" The entire room instantly fell dead silent. Don's manager stood at the corner of the stage, his face completely drained of color. Not stopping there, seeing Sinatra remain frozen, Don delivered a finishing blow by bringing up the war film The Pride and the Passion, which Sinatra had just starred in. "I just saw your movie, Frank." And I have to be honest, the performance by the brass cannon in that film was the absolute best. Your acting was completely worthless. It was a gamble so reckless it bordered on madness. Rumor had it that Sinatra could turn anyone's career into dust with a single snap of his fingers. But then, a roaring laugh shattered the ice. Sinatra was stunned for a few seconds before suddenly slapping his thighs, laughing so hard that tears welled up in his eyes. The boss was thoroughly amused by the sheer audacity and utter insolence of this bald comedian. Frank Sinatra's nod and laughter that night blew wide open the doors, leading Don Rickles to the holy land of Las Vegas. Sinatra began dragging the entire powerful Rat Pack, including Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., to watch Don perform. From an absolute nobody, Don Rickles became a one-of-a-kind sensation at the biggest Vegas casinos like the Sands or the Sahara. People began whispering a hidden rule to one another. In Vegas, if you haven't been insulted straight to your face by Don Rickles in front of everyone, it means you are nobody. Looking at Don Rickles at the pinnacle of his fame, from the 1960s onward, critics of the era always scratched their heads trying to find the answer to one question. Why would an American society, which highly valued etiquette, go absolutely crazy over a man who specialized in pulling the appearance, skin color, ethnicity, and religion of others out to make a mockery of them? In reality, Don's genius lay in the fact that he elevated insults into a superb art form of absolute equality. He spared no one. He blasted the wealthy tycoon sitting in the front row no differently than he teased the poor waiter serving drinks. In Don's cathedral of comedy, everyone was equal before their own flaws. He transformed the prejudices and fears that divided people back then into a liberating roar of laughter. In his 2007 autobiography, Rickles' book, a memoir, the king of comedy unveiled the humane core hidden behind his toxic exterior with deeply reflective words. People always use the word insult when labeling me, but I know deep down in my heart I have never hurt anyone out of genuine malice. If I brought hatred onto the stage, the audience would sense it immediately, and I would have been kicked out of Hollywood long ago. What I do is merely exaggerate and mock all of our deepest insecurities so that we realize we are all just flawed human beings and look upon each other with tolerance. Because of this, audiences didn't come to him out of anger. They paid to be attacked by him, to strip away the serious, dignified masks they had to wear every single day. When he called someone a hockey puck, it was actually a linguistic embrace, a gentle reminder. Don't take this life too seriously. However, walking on a razor's edge means you're bound to get cut eventually. Throughout his years reigning at the top, Don Rickles crossed paths with notorious backstage altercations on more than a few occasions, incidents that came perilously close to putting a final stop to his entire career and sometimes even his life. In the 1960s, Las Vegas casinos and New Jersey nightclubs were mostly under the tight underground grip of the mafia. Don Rickles knew this all too well, but a comedian's instinct sometimes moves faster than reason. During a performance in New Jersey, Don looked down at a VIP table and spotted a couple. A heavily built man with a stone-cold expression, dressed in an expensive suit, accompanied by a rather rugged, heavy-set woman. Don pointed down and asked, "Is that your wife?" The man gave a slight, emotionless nod. Don then blurted out an impulsive joke. "She looks like a moose." The showroom erupted in laughter, but that man didn't change his expression. He just stared silently at Don with the eyes of a killer. The moment the curtain closed and Don Rickles returned to his dressing room, the door was suddenly kicked open. The man and three thuggish associates barged in, locking the door behind them. As it turned out, he was a notorious, high-profile local mafia boss. He cornered Don against the wall, his voice rasping with deadly intent. "Say that again. What does my wife look like?" The line between laughter and death had never been so thin. All of Don's onstage cockiness vanished into thin air. Sweating profusely, he repeatedly bowed his head, pleading with the utmost humility and sincerity, I am so sorry, boss. I swear to God it was just an act. On stage, I'm a crazy guy. I'm just trying to do comedy to make money and support my old mother at home. Please forgive me." Don't trembling yet completely honest attitude move the mob boss. He stared at Don for a long moment, then suddenly slapped his shoulder with a booming laugh. "You crazy bastard, you're right. She really does look like a moose. I like your honesty." That night, Don escaped death by a whisker, but it was a bloody lesson about the power of the backstage shadows that he would never forget. While the clash with the mafia was a physical threat, the 1976 incident with Johnny Carson, the most powerful man at the NBC television network, was a seismic shockwave that directly threatened his career. During an appearance as a guest on the nationally broadcasted program The Tonight Show, Don Rickles got so carried away with his performance that he accidentally slammed his hand down onto the desk, cracking Johnny Carson's hand-carved wooden cigarette box right in half. It is worth noting that this box was a priceless keepsake that Carson deeply treasured, keeping it in a fixed spot on his desk for years. Carson was stunned to discover that his cherished cigarette box, a 9-year-old memento from his days back in New York, was completely fractured.
Oh, Carson's cigarette box! Oh, I broke his box! I broke Carson's cigarette box! It's my Johnny's box! Johnny's cigarette box! Wait a minute!
Everyone in Hollywood knew that Carson was a man who could lift an artist to the stars, but could just as easily bury their career in the mud with a single nod. Fear and regret consumed Don Rickles for the rest of that night. The very next day, an unprecedented event occurred that shook the NBC studios. Knowing that Don Rickles was taping his television sitcom, CPO. Sharky at the studio right next door, Johnny Carson abruptly interrupted his own show. Holding the broken wooden box and leading a full camera crew, he marched straight into Don's studio while the cameras were rolling live. Carson barged right into the middle of the scene to the bewilderment of the entire crew, demanding that Don stand up and take responsibility.
Somebody broke my cigarette box. Come here. We're taping. I just started the show. I picked my box up off my desk that I've had for 9 years. My box is broken.
Although Don used his quick wit to transform the mishap into a legendary comedic routine that went down in television history, NBC staff later admitted that he was utterly terrified, knowing he had come perilously close to losing the trust of his most powerful friend. As time marched on, American society began shifting into a new era, an era defined by strict political correctness. The jokes, targeting ethnicity and religion, that were considered ordinary in the 70s were now easily labeled as offensive and deeply racist. Don Rickles' comedic style suddenly turned into a ticking time bomb in the modern world. And in 2012, that bomb finally went off. At the American Film Institute AFI Life Achievement Awards ceremony, honoring actress Shirley MacLaine, Don Rickles, by then an 86-year-old man, took the stage. Looking down at the audience, he suddenly set his sights on the sitting president at the time, Barack Obama. I shouldn't talk about blacks. President Obama is a personal friend of mine. He was over to the house yesterday, but the mop broke. The joke, which likened the first black president of the United States to a janitor, immediately ignited a massive wave of fury across the media and social platforms. Critics blasted him as old, outdated, and severely racist. The scandal grew so intense that the AFI organizers had to make a painful decision: completely cut this entire routine from the official television broadcast to appease the public. For Don Rickles, a scandal at an age when he was so close to the end of his life brought him profound sadness. He never intended to hurt anyone. He was simply doing the job he had dedicated his entire life to, finding human insecurities and dissolving them with laughter. It was just that the world around him had changed. People had begun scrutinizing jokes through a much harsher lens, and the tolerance for old-school values was fading away. Having weathered so many storms, scaling the dazzling heights of fame and surviving breathless moments backstage, Don Rickles still stood firm as an untouchable monument. People feared his mouth, but they loved his heart unconditionally. Yet, have you ever wondered what helped a man carrying the most toxic reputation in Hollywood maintain peace and warmth in his soul after so many fierce tempests in life? The answer certainly does not lie within the glittering, neon-lit casinos of Las Vegas. Instead, it was tucked away in a deeply tender corner of his life, where an unyielding, faithful love story spanning over half a century awaited to be unfolded. Don Rickles' greatest source of strength throughout the storms of his life was Barbara Sklar. They officially married on the 14th of March, 1965. When Don was already 38 years old, considered quite late to start a family in that era. The two met through Don's manager, who introduced Barbara, then a humble secretary, to the rising comedian. Despite the swagger and confidence he projected on stage, Don was, in real life, an incredibly shy man who was deeply insecure about his appearance. But Barbara saw what the rest of the world had overlooked: a kind, warm heart and the hidden wounds of a man whose dream of becoming a dramatic actor had been buried beneath years of disappointment. She chose to love him and became the unwavering foundation that allowed him to pursue his passion without restraint. There was one amusing yet deeply admirable truth about their marriage. Although Don loved Barbara more than life itself, he simply could not resist making her the target of his jokes on stage. Las Vegas audiences became accustomed to his legendary one-liners about his wife, such as, "My wife Barbara is a wonderful woman." Watching her walk is like watching a moving jewelry store, because she has to wear all the gold and diamonds I buy her to apologize for the trouble my big mouth gets me into. Other times he would poke fun at her spending habits in front of thousands of spectators. "Every time my wife goes to the mall, she tells the sales clerk, 'Show me something that's worth more than my husband's life.'" The audience would erupt with laughter, but everyone understood that this was simply Don's unique way of expressing love. Once the curtain fell, he never let go of Barbara's hand. Throughout their 52 years together, until the day he passed away, Don remained a devoted husband and a dedicated father, completely untouched by the temptations and excesses of Hollywood. Barbara was the only person capable of stripping away Don's tough exterior and revealing the man he truly was, a genuinely warm-hearted gentleman. With a peaceful home as his anchor, Don Rickles' television career soared throughout the 1970s and beyond, reaching heights few could rival. He became a phenomenon, an untouchable icon of American television. Do you know which television program became most closely associated with Don Rickles? It was The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, appearing more than 100 times as both a guest and occasional guest host. Don transformed the show into his own comedic playground. The chemistry between Johnny Carson's polished elegance and Don Rickles' wild unpredictability created some of the most unforgettable moments in television history. Don was perhaps the only man alive bold enough to march straight to Carson's desk, point a finger at the most powerful television host in America, and call him a tough guy in front of millions of viewers watching from home. Yet the true pinnacle of Don Rickles' insult comedy came through the Dean Martin Celebrity Roast. Imagine an elegant ballroom inside the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, filled with cigarette smoke and some of Hollywood's greatest legends, from Lucille Ball and Bob Hope to sports icons like Muhammad Ali. They all sat there, both anxious and excited, waiting for Don Rickles to step onto the stage. Every time he appeared, he resembled a general marching into battle, unleashing relentless barrages of razor-sharp jokes at everyone in the room without sparing a single soul. He made Sammy Davis Jr. laugh so hard that he nearly fell out of his chair, and even Ronald Reagan, then governor of California, was left clutching his stomach with laughter. People began calling him the Roast Master General, the supreme commander of celebrity roasts. At that point, becoming the target of Don Rickles' insults was no longer considered an embarrassment. It had become a badge of honor, proof that you had truly reached the pinnacle of fame. Just when people believed Don Rickles had already reached the peak of television and stand-up comedy, he surprised everyone by returning to conquer the silver screen in 1995 at nearly 70 years old. It marked a remarkable turning point, as the dramatic acting skills he had once studied at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts talents, seemingly buried after the devastating loss of his father in 1953, were suddenly brought back to life. Legendary director Martin Scorsese, famously selective when casting actors, recognized something unmistakably authentic about Don, a quality that felt raw, real, and unmistakably Las Vegas. Scorsese cast him as Billy Sherbert, the cold, calculating casino manager and trusted right-hand man to Robert De Niro's character in the acclaimed film Casino. Gone was the goofy comedian audiences knew from the stage. On the big screen, Don Rickles became a tough, cunning, and powerful figure. Sharing scenes with giants like Robert De Niro, Joe Pesci, and Sharon Stone, he more than held his own, proving to the world that he was a genuinely talented actor, not merely a master of sharp-tongued insults. That same fateful year, 1995, brought another miracle into Don Rickles' life, but this time from an entirely different world, the world of children's entertainment. As Pixar was producing the world's first fully computer-animated feature film, Toy Story, the filmmakers struggled to find the perfect voice for Mr. Potato Head, a toy with a gruff, short-tempered personality, hiding a fiercely loyal and kind heart. Director John Lasseter immediately thought of Don Rickles. At first, Don flatly declined the offer. He believed a comedian known for entertaining adults in Las Vegas had no place in a children's animated film. But Lasseter refused to give up. He repeatedly assured Don that the character had been written specifically with him in mind. Eventually, Don agreed. And the rest, as they say, is history. Don Rickles breathed life into Mr. Potato Head, with his unmistakable, raspy, blunt voice, transforming a plastic potato into one of the most beloved animated characters of all time. Almost overnight, the comedian, once viewed cautiously by parents, because of his edgy humor, became a hero to millions of children around the world. After more than half a century of tireless contributions to entertainment, Don Rickles was finally rewarded with some of the industry's highest honors. In 2000, his name was permanently engraved on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, a lasting tribute to the extraordinary journey of the young boy who had once dreamed big in Queens. Yet the award that filled him with the greatest pride and emotion came in 2008 when he won a Primetime Emmy Award for the acclaimed documentary about his own life, Mr. Warmth, the Don Rickles Project. That Emmy was far more than a professional achievement. It felt like the entire American entertainment industry bowing in profound respect to a man who had devoted his life to making the world laugh. At 82 years old, standing on the Emmy stage, Don Rickles cried. They were tears of fulfillment, tears shed by a warrior who had endured countless storms before finally reaching the summit of glory. By then, Don Rickles' life seemed complete. He had everything a person could hope for. A legendary career spanning the stage, television, and film. An enduring and faithful love shared with his beloved wife, and the admiration of both his peers and the public. It seemed only natural that he would spend the rest of his days enjoying the peaceful rewards of a life so richly lived. But life is often written by a cruel screenwriter, and fate has a way of balancing every great joy with unimaginable sorrow. Just as Don Rickles stood at the very peak of fulfillment, destiny quietly delivered a devastating blow, a tragedy so painful that it shattered the spirit of the king of insult comedy, leaving behind a wound that would continue to bleed until his very last breath. To truly understand the deep bond within Don Rickles' family, you first have to realize that in a Hollywood filled with temptation and broken marriages, Don protected his home as if it were his greatest treasure. He and Barbara had 2 children, their eldest daughter Mindy and their youngest son Larry Rickles. Larry was not only Don's only son, but also his closest companion, the person who understood and admired his father's career more than anyone else. Larry Rickles grew up to become a talented screenwriter and producer in Los Angeles. It was he who conceived, championed, and personally produced the acclaimed 2007 documentary, Mr. Warmth, the Don Rickles Project, as a tribute to his father. When father and son stood side by side to accept the Primetime Emmy Award in 2008, Don Rickles could hardly contain his overwhelming joy. In his 2008 book, Rickles' Letters, he wrote about Larry with heartfelt pride. The fact that this was a father and son project is one of the greatest highlights of my life. Watching my son grow into a man recognized by the whole world means more to me than any standing ovation I ever received in Las Vegas. But that chapter of happiness proved heartbreakingly brief. On the 3rd of December 2011, a dark cloud suddenly descended upon the Rickles family in Los Angeles. Larry Rickles passed away unexpectedly at the age of 41. The cause of death was determined to be respiratory failure resulting from severe complications of pneumonia. Have you ever witnessed a parent burying their own child? It is a grief beyond the endurance of any mother or father, especially for Don Rickles, who was already 85 years old at the time. The son who had been his greatest pride, his future, and the person who understood him best, was suddenly gone, reduced to ashes. Larry's sudden death completely shattered the spirit of the king of insult comedy. Those closest to him, from comedian Bob Newhart to television host Jimmy Kimmel, later recalled that after Larry's death, Don Rickles became a different man. Behind the scenes, he would sit silently in his dressing room for hours, his eyes fixed blankly on empty space. The mischievous sparkle that had once defined the merchant of venom was forever veiled by the heavy fog of grief. He still smiled and joked whenever he faced an audience, but it was the smile of a man desperately trying to hide the quiet sobs within. After the tragedy of losing his son, many believed Don Rickles would retire from show business and spend the rest of his life consumed by grief. But once again, the instincts of the former U.S. Navy serviceman rose to the surface. He refused the world's pity. He refused to sit still and let sorrow slowly devour his soul. When reporters asked why he did not choose retirement, Don Rickles answered with the spirit of a true warrior. "Why should I retire? I'm a fighter. When the bell rings, I have to step into the ring. The stage is the only place where I still feel alive. It's the only place where I can forget, even for a little while, what's tearing me apart inside." Even so, the final years of his life became entangled in a different kind of scandal, one unique to the modern era. By the time he was nearly 90, Don's health had deteriorated dramatically. Severe leg infections and multiple surgeries left him unable to stand on stage, forcing him to perform from a wheelchair. This sparked a wave of controversy among critics. Many younger writers and social activists argued that Don Rickles' style of insult comedy had become outdated, even cruel. They criticized the image of an elderly man in a wheelchair, using blunt, politically incorrect jokes to roast audiences at a time when political correctness was becoming increasingly influential. On some nights, younger audience members even walked out in the middle of his performances, unable to tolerate his razor-sharp humor. Critics were eager to label him as a stubborn performer who refused to accept that his time had passed. But Don Rickles never apologized for who he was. He defended his legacy until the very end. To him, comedy had to be honest. And if he changed merely to satisfy public opinion, then he would no longer be Don Rickles. He would rather be disliked for being authentic than celebrated for pretending to be someone else. And so Don Rickles spent the final years of his life giving everything he had left to make people laugh. He continued appearing on late-night talk shows with Jimmy Kimmel and David Letterman, still leaving audiences in stitches even as his voice had grown noticeably weaker and more fragile. The last project he poured his heart into was preparing to reprise the voice of Mr. Potato Head for Toy Story 4. He wanted it to be one final gift for generations of children. But that day would never come. On the 6th of April 2017, at his home in Los Angeles, California, the heart of the king of insult comedy finally stopped beating. Don Rickles passed away from chronic kidney failure at the age of 90, just 1 month before what would have been his 91st birthday and the 52nd anniversary of his marriage to Barbara. He died peacefully in his own bed, surrounded by the love of his devoted wife and his daughter, Mindy. Don Rickles' passing left an irreplaceable void in the hearts of his fans and throughout Hollywood. Ironically, he died before recording a single line for Toy Story 4. Yet, out of profound love and respect for him, Pixar's director and production team did something unprecedented. With the permission of Don's family, they searched through every archived recording they could find, unused dialogue, discarded takes, and even fragments of laughter, spanning more than 25 years, to piece together Mr. Potato Head's dialogue for the 2019 film. In a remarkable way, Don Rickles' legacy continued to live on long after he himself had returned to dust. Don Rickles, brought to a close, a life filled with heartbreaking contradictions. He was a man who spent his entire career using sharp-edged humor to bring joy to others. A father forced to bury his only son, and an artist who stood his ground against the relentless passage of time with unwavering determination. Don Rickles' final resting place is at Mount Sinai Memorial Park Cemetery, Hollywood Hills, in Los Angeles, California. It is a peaceful sanctuary, bathed in sunshine and shaded by rows of trees, where many of the most celebrated Jewish entertainers have found eternal rest. His grave is simple and unpretentious, much like the man he truly was, away from the spotlight, on a gray granite headstone. His name is engraved with dignity beside that of his devoted wife, Barbara Sklar, who was laid to rest alongside him in 2021. But what moves nearly everyone who visits the site to tears is that Don's grave lies right beside that of Larry Rickles, the only son he spent the last years of his life mourning. The unbearable sorrow of a father forced to bury his own child, a grief that tore at his heart for 6 long years, has finally been eased through an eternal reunion beneath the quiet earth. There are no longer silent tears shed by an aging father in the middle of the night, no more painful moments hidden behind the bright lights of the stage. There is only perfect peace, where father and son are together once again, overlooking the flower-filled valley below. Although his body has returned to the earth, Don Rickles' spirit and unmistakable voice have never truly disappeared. His legacy lives on in every frame of his documentaries, in the legendary bursts of laughter from The Tonight Show, and above all, in the love that millions of children still have for Mr. Potato Head. Pixar's decision not to recast the role, but instead to painstakingly assemble his performance from decades of archived recordings in order to complete Toy Story 4, remains the greatest testament of all. Don Rickles was one of a kind, and no one could ever replace him. A new generation of comedians, including Chris Rock and Jimmy Kimmel, continue to look to Don Rickles as a beacon of courage. He taught them that a true comedian should never bow to fear, but should also embrace audiences with the purest sincerity and heart. The nickname Mr. Warmth, once used ironically to poke fun at him, ultimately became the truest description of who he really was. He was Mr. Warmth, not because he spoke gentle words, but because the passion and love for people that burned within him were so immense that they warmed an entire era of entertainment spanning more than half a century. Don Rickles completed the journey of a remarkable life and brought an extraordinary legend to its close. Yet the laughter he left behind continues to echo, and it always will.